Hello again. I'm still Steve Flanders. This is once again 15 Minutes to Save America. This is episode number 10. Now, last time we talked about the First Amendment, made the point that the founders realized there's had to be some kind of relationship between church and state. The wording of the First Amendment is really the proof of their reasoning, especially the word respecting. So, I'll real quick read it to you from my handy dandy little Constitution here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's a limit on the federal Congress. It's a limit on what Congress can do. It is not a statement of right, privilege, or immunity that accrues to individuals and can be protected against state action. At least that's the way it stood until the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment with corporate personhood, and now this, more mischief's been done in the name of the 14th Amendment than all the rest of them combined. Let me read the pertinent passages of the 14th Amendment. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It was written for the just freed slaves to make it clear that Dred Scott no longer applied and that no longer enslaved black people were going to receive equal justice before the law. That's okay. All kind of started falling apart. The first thing that happened in Crookshank, U.S. v. Crookshank, that's 92 U.S. 542, 552 from 1875. In that case, black folks were trying to meet to organize politically down in Louisiana. They kept getting terrorized by the white folks in the region. And the Supreme Court, a la 1875, didn't really see much reason for enforcing that equal protection part of the 14th Amendment. So they ruled against them. But in a very snide, racist little piece of dictum to the side, they let it be known if they had been meeting to petition Congress, it might have been a different matter. That's how it stood in 1875 and left it. Rolled around to 1905. In the case of Patterson v. Colorado, 205 U.S. 454, 462, 1905. These are all much more in-depth analysis in the linked essay I'm going to show later. Mr. Justice John Marshall Harlan, in a famous dissent. He also dissented in Plessy versus Ferguson against the odious doctrine of separate but equal. So the guy had some good qualities. But he, in his dissent, it was a very influential dissent. He basically put forth the arguments for our present reading of the First Amendment as a statement of secular humanist values. The court engaged in a little bit of dialogue with him in that case, saying, we don't know whether or not the first is contained within the 14th, but blah, 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 went on and ruled against the plaintiff, ruled in favor of Colorado being able to have laws against seditious literature. 15 years later, the Supreme Court started bringing the subject up again and started seeming to assume that, yes, indeed, they did have that power. The first is contained within the 14th Amendment. Some of them, Gitlow, Neer, Stromberg, a whole slew of cases. During that time, one of the justices formulated the idea of freedom of speech doesn't allow people to shout fire in a crowded theater, which is very true, very wise, and would be very good statement from any state legislature or from a county judge. But when issued by the Supreme Court, it has to be in contrast with Jefferson's idea out of the Kentucky Resolution that such subjects are withheld from the cognizance of federal tribunals. Anyway, they continued that dialogue, like I say, assuming the first was within the 14th, accumulating a huge amount of smaller cases. It all came together in 1947 in the case of Everson versus the Board of Education, 330 U.S. 1, 1947. Amalgamating all these cases and using them as precedent, they issued a huge amount of dictum in this case, talking about the separation of church and state had to apply to the states. That's where they first started talking about the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause. That's where all these things first entered America's jurisprudence. But there was no resistance to the ruling because, for other reasons, they found that, well, yes, indeed, the school board in Everson could continue to transport parochial school students. And so there was no popular resistance to the ruling. That was 1947. Long about 1960, they started referring back to that whole sheaf of dictum out of Everson and started throwing prayer out of school, started throwing Bible reading and Bible presence out of public schools. And anybody that went and looked at it found that, well, yeah, they were referring to this case where that stuff was written, and there was no popular resentment. It sat there for 13 years with nobody trying to overturn it. So it must have some real validity, and left it at that. So nobody ever questioned it. And all of a sudden, then the Supreme Court started saying there couldn't be any laws against pornography, any laws against lewd entertainment or dancing. The localities had to allow it. You couldn't have laws against seditious literature anymore. Couldn't have laws against flag burning. But then, in their own inimitable way, they said, well, gee, we do need some kind of laws about some things. And so they started issuing guidance about hate speech and ethnic intimidation, what can be allowed, what couldn't be allowed. And looking at the entire process, going back to the passage of the 14th Amendment and, through Cruikshank, which didn't really mean anything at the time, but Harlan's dissent and using Cruikshank, Cruikshank was the only case he referred to. And the whole thing is just one long process of usurping the powers of moral self-government from the people, the states, and their communities, and putting it into the hands of the federal government. In the end, well, and the next time I'll start looking at the philosophy and how this has been used and why it's so wrong philosophically. But in the end, the perfect crime has been committed. Because the victims, that's you and me and the rest of the people in this country, for the most part, consider themselves the beneficiaries. We don't even realize how badly we've been wounded with this usurpation, and are probably, right now, most people watching this thinking, I'm crazy for even bringing it up like this. Well, watch next time. Go to the link and you'll be able to read ahead. Go to the linked essay, but be sure and follow and share this. Thank you very much. Once again, just to review and set it up for next time. The blog is lifeinafascistcountry.blogspot.com. The entire book that I'm basing this on is all free, and it's in a series of links. The first link is this one here. I'll point to it. lifeinafascistcountry.blogspot.com 202502. How and why to save America. And all this stuff about the First Amendment, and quite a bit more, is at this one right here, and how the First Amendment was stolen, HTML, with lifeinafascistcountry.blogspot.com. At that First Amendment link, I go in depth into Harlan's dissent because I do consider it the best argument the court ever put out for our present reading of the First Amendment. And in my own humble opinion, I dissect him perfectly and completely. But you're going to have to read it. to find that out, because it's like, that's a long time to sit and listen to me and look at my face. I'm stuck with it, but you don't have to be. Anyway, once again, we started with the telegraph in press control, went to corporate personhood, 16th, 17th, 18th Amendments, and government by expert, the Federal Reserve, Roosevelt fascist coup and everything, and the 1947 First Amendment has been completely overturned. Next time, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about the philosophy and why that's such a bad way to go and how poorly we've been used with it. Just as another note, you might notice that this time it's going to be a few minutes short of 15 minutes. The last one was a little bit longer than 15 minutes, I realize. Most of them trying to hit that. It's a goal. I try to not go much over because I just, I'll put this in here right now. I want to communicate. And that's why I put my face on there. I know that communication is easier when people can see my eyes and my expression and can understand it and get it from the voice. It's way better than writing. I mean, you go to the book blog, and you can see I'm more than capable of putting out a word salad. Very few people like reading word salads anymore. And I don't really enjoy these long-term, long-form podcasts where people say something, about they've got about 3 minutes worth of really good content, but you have to listen for an hour and a half to get to it. So that's why I decided on doing this in 15-minute blocks, because I think that's probably going to be the best way to keep people engaged, be able to go through this, and you also kind of know where I'm going with it. You can read ahead. I encourage you to, but I'll get to everything through this, and then once I've done all this, then it's going to go more to a typical podcast. Maybe even have other people to talk with, and catching up how this applies to current events and everything else. So that's just explaining where I'm coming from and how I'm trying to proceed, because frankly, it's just what I wish people would do with me, and that's how I would like this. I just wish I was a better spokesperson. Wish I looked prettier, but hey, you got what you got. Anyway, be sure and share and follow. Talk to you later. Bye.